Welcome to the Sensible Socialist Podcast, a podcast for the rational left.
We need to unite and work together if we're all going to get through this. Sounds like socialism to me.
The amount of people I see talking about socialism positively is actually staggering.
Do you think, do you really think that a proletarian revolution is just around the corner in America?
Grab your pitchforks and stab your mayor.
Your hero, Obama.
He's not my hero.
How heroic he comes from.
If Bernie Sanders were president, right, and he wanted to bring the same ideas for socialism into this country, do you think that we would benefit?
Yeah.
But I just told you Venezuela's eating rats.
But I just want people to have health care. I don't want,
Same thing Hugo Chavez.
oh my god. You people have, worms in your brain, honestly.
Welcome to the Sensible Socialist Podcast, a podcast for the rational left. I'm your host, Kevin Gustafson, and with me is Michael Shallal. Michael, thanks for being here.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
All right, so I want to just start out the way I start out with most people, which is just a bit of a background. So if you give a bit of a background and in some ways lead that into how you became a socialist.
Yeah, so just again, thanks for having me on. I've listened to a bunch of your shows and I think it's great what you do.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it.
So I've been a activist for about 10 years, 11 years now. A lot of that came through radicalization through the Iraq War and protesting against U.S. intervention, like in the Middle East. And after that, I remember I was involved in the environmental movement for a while in college. There was a big spike in activism around Obama's campaign, trying to get him to commit to, more green energy type policies and stuff. And then from there, basically, I was introduced to socialist ideas while I was living in Detroit, which, as most people know, Detroit has a huge economic inequality. And, I grew up outside of Detroit in the suburbs, about 20 miles north. But my dad owned a liquor store in the city. So growing up, I would always go down, to the store, help my dad work at the job. And just seeing that, coming from the suburbs, coming from a more middle class area, and then experiencing Detroit, I saw these two different, tale of two cities type of thing, right?
Sure.
And so I think, that combined with living in the city and connecting with the social movements that were happening in the city, it really just showed me that there was a lot wrong. And then I guess I was looking for alternatives, right? As one would do if you think, things are wrong, you gotta, what's right?
Yeah.
So, that led me to socialist ideas. And then I joined the International Socialist Organization in 2014, 2015. From there I got a lot of my education through the ISO. And then I moved to DC, where I'm living now. We have, I've been here for about 5 years, and mainly most of my organizing has been focused probably in the last 2 years on anti-fascism and fighting the far right.
All right, so that's definitely what I wanted to talk mostly about. The big question I guess I have is the anti-fascism has a long and I would say noble tradition. Came out of being anti-fascist. It sort of came out of the rise of the fascists in the 1930s. There's always been, there's an anti-fascism, like a liberal anti-fascism. I remember seeing a lot of memes about D-Day being, anti-fascist in some ways, and in some ways it is. There was an entire war that was fought from liberal democracies and the Soviet Union against fascism. but it has a long tradition of socialists and communists and even anarchists. And that, I think, one thing is just an introduction. Maybe I want to hear more about what you're doing specifically, but what do you think about Antifa?
Okay, yeah. Antifa is short for anti-fascist, and the media, the mass media, basically, a lot of the corporate media has used Antifa to describe the anti-fascist movement as being as being violent, basically, and using the tactic of physical confrontation to what's called deplatform fascists or Nazis taking away their ability to speak in public. To basically break that down, within the anti-fascist movement, there are multiple different types of tactics that activists use to confront the far right. And Antifa, how it's described in the media, they actually are just describing a tactic. When they talk about Antifa, a lot of the time, they're mentioning the group specifically as the people who are using physical confrontation, when really the movement has a lot of different tactics that it uses. And so I'm for, supporting Antifa, anti-fascism, and I think having a democratic, open space where we can talk about tactics and what's the best tactic for the situation we're in is the way we should be moving forward.
Yeah, I think that's important. The idea that Antifa, is wholly representative. I mean, Antifa isn't even an organized group. It doesn't have an organized structure. There's no hierarchy or leadership of Antifa.
Yeah, so there's Antifa crews, right, that represent different cities and different locations. And a lot of those groups are organized horizontally and don't really have a leadership structure. Or, they probably do, but it's not a formal one. And, that's the way that they choose to organize. And right now I'm kind of in the middle of trying to build a national coalition that is trying to organize smaller local coalitions that do have more formal leadership and can represent the anti-fascist movement in a more sort of official capacity in a way that's democratic.
Yeah, I always thought that was one of the sort of, I experienced the Occupy movement and the sort of horizontalism that was involved in Occupy, and that was, in all honesty, one of the more frustrating parts about it was the fact that it sounds like a good idea, a more horizontalist approach. It sounds in this idea democratic and stuff.
It's the most democratic.
Yeah,
right?
and the thing about that is that it also is the most inefficient, and it tends to there's a way that you have a lot of different forces that come in that can be very disruptive, that can really stall and so.
Can we talk about Occupy and consensus and,
in theory, consensus is a way that you would want to go. It is an understandable idea, and you want to use consensus as to unite the group. But consensus is a really difficult thing to get. In any more than 3 people, consensus becomes very difficult. And there's a reason why democracy and democratic ideals have moved in the way that they do towards majority rule and those kinds of things. And I think both of us, are in agreement that the principle of democratic centralism is actually a really important thing that was missing from Occupy, and I think missing from Antifa. This idea that there can be democracy, but there also needs to be some kind of centralized decision making and a united front kind of presented.
Yeah, during Occupy, it was interesting. I remember reading an article that it made sense to me. It's we live in such an undemocratic society. So, given that, it actually makes a lot of sense that people go all the way to the other direction to get as much democracy as they think they can have, which is direct democracy, participatory democracy, where it's like, everyone's vote counts sort of thing, where because the society that we live in, our votes don't mean shit, basically.
Yeah, right.
And so it's like, yeah, of course people are going to like kind of go radically to the other direction so they can have that sense of democracy. But but now we did that, and we saw like how that affected the movement, and how it was like really difficult to continue building Occupy and like broadening and bringing more people in when we all had to like agree on everything.
Yeah.
Consensus was really developed for like small religious communities historically, which have like a very similar values. And, Occupy was not that.
Right. You had a lot of people coming to Occupy for a lot of different reasons.
Yeah.
And as much as I'd like to think it was a new insurgent communist uprising, it really wasn't. I remember the Occupy that I was a part of had a bunch of libertarian people who were a part of it, a lot of like Ron Paul people and stuff like that. And that tended to really, the kind of diversity demanded a more formal democratic structure of, majority voting and majority rules, but minority rights, those kinds of issues that are in some ways the best parts of the tradition of the American experiment. That I understand that it's been distorted greatly in the course of our history, but at least in principle, those are really important things. So
we could talk about Occupy like all.
I know.
All day,
I really think I need an episode wholly on Occupy just to try to. But going back to it gives me like PTSD. So when you look at the where Antifa started in the 30s, you had legitimate fascist organizations, Mussolini, Hitler, Franco, that were openly calling themselves fascist and using what I think are emblematic fascist tactics, like beating up the far left, storming into meetings and when you get into power, imprisoning people and engaging in sort of violent acts of sabotage and other kinds of things. And so when we are talking about fascism nowadays, we don't see those kinds of things in that kind of organized way through organized fascist parties, not in terms of the large parties that are able to march on Rome or something like that. Yeah. So why anti-fascism now? What do you see? Like, how do you see fascism today?
Yeah, so it's interesting because if we were talking 2 years ago, before 2016, I might not be so sure that we would be talking about, why fascism, why do we need to build a movement against fascism? But I think over the last 2 years, especially since Donald Trump's election, we've seen the need for a, coherent, organized anti-fascist movement to counter the growing far right, not just in the United States, but globally. And we're seeing that through, unfortunately, like horrible acts of violence, mass murder, racist vigilante actions. We're seeing it on the border with like organized, nationalist like militias. Basically, the threat is very real and the danger is very real. And that became clear in the first couple of months of Donald Trump's presidency through the murder of Richard Collins at UMD, University of Maryland, and also the Portland stabbings that happened on the subway, both of which the attackers, said something racist right before they like killed the people. Both of them were stabbings as well. And at that time, I was organizing with the ISO. We saw this. We saw the need to, organize around this issue and sort of like use it to galvanize people against the growing far right and start to educate people about what's going on and the dangers of a sort of far right that's like run amok, like allowed to just organize in the open. And we started to see them organize in the open through free speech rallies, so-called free speech rallies. And these actually came out of like, it's like a iteration of Donald Trump rallies. Like these people went to Donald Trump's campaign rallies, they felt the feeling of like being around all the, similar bigots as themselves. They felt that whatever they felt, there was an active sort of, far right that was emboldened from Trump, right? And then there's also this white supremacist, so-called alt-right that has emerged. These two groups, one slightly more like, I call them Trump racist. They're not like Nazis, white supremacists, but they're like, Republicans, and they try and like, they want to like work through the Republican Party.
Like the Steve Bannons of the world.
Yeah, the Steve Bannons he's actually an interesting character. I wrote him down on my notes because I think he is sort of this like link between the like more mainstream Republican like racist and like Donald Trump and the like more from below sort of white supremacist like fascist organizations.
Yeah, it's a nationalist message.
Yeah. I mean, okay, so I was, not to get too far off, but we're talking about Bannon, and I was reading the manifesto of the New Zealand shooter. It's called like the Great Regroupment, which I recommend people checking it out. It's really disturbing, but it also is very coherent, and it sort of lays out a strategy for individual racists to sort of take on as their own, as a way of like eventually destabilizing the system to be able to then take power.
Wow.
And he uses a lot of the same type of rhetoric that Bannon uses, like around
cultural Marxism.
Yeah, basically. And also like this, also this anti-capitalist perspective, where they actually blame Wall Street and like white CEOs who are like sellouts to the race, for the reason for like immigrant populations coming into like European countries, because these CEOs, these bosses, they need workers, so they bring in cheap labor, and that's like hurting our like white Eurocentric, like,
which is something that's a fascist sort of trope. I mean, that the whole idea of fascism was like it was a third way between the sort of decadent capitalist West and the Asiatic Bolshevism.
The Nazi slogan of there's 500,000 unemployed Germans and 400,000 Jews. That was like their slogan,
right?
And they're basically saying these people are taking your jobs. And so another interesting tidbit about that manifesto, Tarrant, his last name is the shooter, he didn't mention like Jewish people once. And there's some debate around why that is. If he specifically left out anything about like Jewish conspiracies as a way to reach out to more like moderate right-wing people, because like the Jewish, anti-Semitism is like sort of like a red flag for a lot of people, where it's like, oh, they hate Jews, they think like there's Jewish conspiracy. I can't listen to that. Otherwise, if you're just talking about,
makes some sense.
Yeah, exactly. It's pretty disgusting.
Which, I mean, if you look at the rise of fascism in Italy, where it originated, there wasn't this as much of this anti-Semitism. That's a very Nazi, a very the German form of fascism kind of thing. And so, I think originally, especially for America, I mean, I had an Italian friend visit, and we were walking up the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, and he sort of stopped for a second and looked and kind of furrowed his brow, and I was like, "What's he looking at?" And then I looked, and I said, "Oh, right, there's fasci, all over the place. I mean, on the Lincoln Memorial, the thing that there's fasci right there. If you look at the in Congress, like right behind Congress, there are." a bundle of sticks pulled together, and that's a fascist symbol. And so you're
bringing up interesting interesting aspects of the history of the United States,
right? Yeah, I mean, there was that giant rally in Madison Square Garden of people who were openly fascist, and fascism in Britain was obviously a big deal, and took an anti-fascist organizing to really stop, and that was a quite violent altercation.
I mean, I think when we're talking about fascism, at least theoretically, you can't separate the ultimate conclusion of colonialism and imperialism with that of fascism. Like the end goal of imperialism and colonialism is fascism. Like, if you take the ideology from those two things, it's like imperialism, like, manifest destiny, right? Like, white people deserve this land, right? And if you keep going with that, where does that end? It ends basically with this white supremacist state that oppresses minorities. And the United States is guilty of colonialism and imperialism, genocide of indigenous people. And it's like, just recently we had a invasion of white supremacists in DC at Politics and Prose, this pretty progressive bookstore.
Right.
There was a author giving a talk on his book about the end of whiteness. I think it was something like that. And members of AIM, the American Identity Movement, which is rebranded itself after Charlottesville. They originally the Identity Europa, and so they're trying to rebrand themselves using the American identity, nationalism, to appeal to more people.
Interesting.
So it's very Trumpian.
And that was, and Politics of Prose is just a few doors down from, Comet Ping Pong, which was the site of the infamous, shooting into the ceiling of the guy who thought that there was the fake news conspiracy about pedophilia in the Hillary Clinton campaign. And so, in DC, we're not definitely not immune, and in some ways a center point for that.
Well, what happened at the bookstore, basically, there was 7 or 8 of them. They stood up and started chanting, "This land is our land."
Wow.
Yeah. And, basically saying, we stole this right fair and square.
And using Woody Guthrie lyrics. The irony of that is pretty amazing.
Yeah, but they were organized. They came in, they disrupted, and then they left. And one of their leaders is actually local in Virginia. Apparently Patrick, I forget his last name, but he's local, and so
so is Richard Spencer.
Well, not anymore. Richard Spencer's gone.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's a while ago he left.
Oh, okay.
Not sure where he ended up, but he's got kicked out of Alexandria.
Right. That's good.
But so we're trying to, locally we're trying to build a new coalition to sort of respond to these types of events, and start to put the anti-fascist movement more on the offensive, instead of always just reacting when racists or white supremacists show up. That we're actually trying to build an anti-fascist movement that's connected to oppressed groups, that's educating people, that's connecting with other anti-fascists around the country to build more organization and more capacity as a movement.
Yeah, and I think it's really necessary to move from the defensive to the, in some ways, the offensive. Not necessarily, trying to go into that Antifa offensive idea where you're using more kinetic, should I say, approaches. But I think part of the reason why, and we don't have to go into super detail about this, but being on the defensive can be very dangerous. And one of the experiences of that's really in still the living memory of people is Charlottesville. You were at Charlottesville. If you could, like, remind people a bit about what Charlottesville was, and give a bit about your personal experience.
Sure. Yeah, of course. Yeah, Charlottesville is hard to talk about. But it came sort of on the heels of the summer after Trump was elected. Everyone knows about the like anti-Confederate flag and statue sort of movement that sort of took shape after the shooting by Dylan Roof in South Carolina. And so basically what happened in Charlottesville, there's Charlottesville, Virginia, there's two statues of Confederate generals, Robert E. Lee and Andrew Jackson, Stonewall Jackson. And there was basically the alt-right and the far right organized a rally called Unite the Right to bring all the different far right groups together and converge on this small little town that has these statues, which the city was trying to get rid of. And so they mobilized to this small town, and in 2 days they sort of had a pogrom, basically, where they marched in the streets, chanted racial, derogatory racial slurs, and targeted minorities, other people, and physically beat them. The first night there was a tiki torch march.
Yeah, very very reminiscent of fascist.
Yeah, I mean it was
like a low rent fascist rally.
Yeah, we were driving down that morning, and we saw a video on our phone of hundreds of basically Nazis marching with torches, no masks. What were they chanting?
Jews will not replace us.
Yeah,
I think.
And blood and soil.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Which is you can't.
Which is a Nazi slogan.
You can't confuse that.
Right. Yeah.
And they converged on a Confederate statue where a few protesters were, in a circle blockading it, and then they started to beat them. Police really in Charlottesville messed up, beyond belief. The next day on Saturday, there was counter protesters. Both sides had equal amounts of numbers. The right wing was very militarized. They had shields, they had weapons. There was militias that were there, both left wing and right wing militias with automatic weapons, and
Jesus.
It was a protest I'd never been to before in my life.
Yeah.
We got there same time as the state of emergency was declared. So that's when we got there.
Wow. Okay.
And so we didn't know really what to do. We went to one of the parks, which was the home base for the left wing, for the anti-racist. And first thing we saw were people with machine guns and red bandanas.
Wow.
Luckily, I knew that red bandanas were a good thing because they were members of Redneck Revolt.
Yeah.
And they knew that we were with them because of our signs and everything. And so we were welcomed in. But at the same time, there was no one at the park. People had dispersed already to try, and it was very confusing what was going on. We would see random militia people walking. We didn't know if they were police or civilians.
Jesus.
At a certain point, the DSA contingent, which had about 50 people, marched in, and then we heard reports of fascists going to the low-income housing projects and called Friendship Courts, which is about 4 blocks away. So with about 50, 70 people, we marched over to Friendship Court to try and deter any kind of violence, try and intimidate. If there was only a few of them, maybe we could intimidate them with our numbers. And that's what everyone chose. You know, everyone knew what we were doing. We chose to go out into the street to like go and defend people.
Yeah.
That's why we came down there. And so we went there. Luckily, there was nothing happening when we went there. So we circled back around. When we circled back around, there was another anti-racist march coming from a different section of downtown.
Oh, wow.
And we sort of merged in this like celebratory like victory march, because the fascists had been like kicked out of the city and like were no longer like on the streets, and we were controlling the streets. And it was like this moment of celebration. It was great. And that lasted for about 5 minutes after we turned left to go back to the park. And then all of a sudden, you know, James Fields ran his car into hundreds of people, injuring 70, killing Heather Heyer. And yeah, that was a horrible sight. I was 5 feet away from the car.
Insane.
The first thing, there was a truck in front. Luckily, I was on closer to the sidewalk. I was like on the sidewalk. And first, there was a truck parked to the left. And first thing I saw were people's bodies being thrown up. And then you could just hear like the sound of like bumper and like bodies.
Man.
And which is like not something you ever want to hear.
Yeah.
It was insane. And then, you know, your adrenaline kicks in, right? And first I was leading the ISO contingent. So like I was basically the point person. You know, we're very organized. Like the ISO is very organized. Like when we put someone in charge, they are the person to listen to.
Yeah.
And so first thing I did was actually ran around the corner to get away from the center of what was going on, because the first thing in my head was, what's next?
Yeah, right.
I looked up at the rooftops,
wondering if somebody was up there.
Wondering if someone was up there just like with a machine gun, like gonna mow us down. So I like went around the corner, got my back up against the wall, so I knew no one was behind me. I could only see in front of me. You know, it's like one of that situation where it's like
you're in a war.
It's like you're in a war. Like it's like what they say when you're in prison on the yard, right? You keep your back to the wall.
Yeah.
No one can come up behind you.
That's crazy.
But after a second, I realized, okay, maybe nothing's happening. I went back in to the center of, you know, where the attack was, and it was just like a bomb went off. There was like blood on the road, people lying on the ground crying. Like when I first turned the corner, there was this like young girl with her nose like bleeding, just like not knowing what to do. And I have no medical like experience at all, which after this experience made me want to, you know, learn how to like give first aid. But I ran back in to try and find people, and we started finding like 2 people at a time. And every time I found one of our comrades, I was like, go back to the park, right? That's where we had our like table set up and where people could go. It was,
That's a traumatic experience.
It's something that I think really has shaped my involvement in anti-fascism. Like after that, like, I don't know, it's just
you saw the real consequences of it.
Absolutely. And like, you know, the people who were in that march, they were like the most radical people in this country. Like they're like communists, socialists, you know, Black Lives Matter, like trans, like these people were the ones on the front lines, and really they didn't get any credit for that.
Right, good people on both sides, I think was the statement from Trump. Yeah. So you went down there because you already, you know, you had heard about this, and that you already had an anti-fascist sort of perspective being a socialist. But you said this was something that really kicked it into overdrive. And I remember, you know, a year later, they wanted to have a Unite the Right 2 rally,
white civil rights rally.
Yeah, and so I guess, you know, bring us at least, you know, tell us about that story. But I mean, in that year period, I mean, that I think is when you know, began doing anti-fascist work, and then tell us about. I think because I think it's a hell of a victory story, and so after Charlottesville, which is such a frustrating and terrible experience. It's and the thing is, I think that the last thing on Charlottesville was, though there was this traumatic event, but it still did seem like the fascists got nowhere. You know, it wasn't really a win for the fascists.
No, actually. So it's funny, like a month before Charlottesville, there was a rally, a free speech rally, a right-wing free speech rally at the Lincoln Memorial with Jason Kessler, who was the organizer of Charlottesville Unite the Right, and Richard Spencer. Mm-hmm. So there was, and they had this rally a month before Charlottesville at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. had about 300 like white supremacists. We organized DC United Against Hate, organized a counter against them, but they outnumbered us, and it was very frightening. 50 Vanguard America people, which is now the Patriot Front, I believe. They're all changing their names after Charlottesville, and that speaks to your question basically.
Not a win.
But what happened was one of the chants at that Lincoln Memorial rally was "Unite the Right." And they were prepping for this bigger rally in Charlottesville. And so, I think if there was like some like intelligence gathering, if there was some like information, like if we knew more, the more information we know, the better we can organize ourselves. I think a lot of the left really underestimated Charlottesville in 2017 and what was going to happen there. I would say the ISO leadership like underestimated it. We had to, I had to work really hard to organize like a regional sort of like regional mobilization, and we lack the numbers in Charlottesville. But just to speak on what your question is, absolutely the right wing overplayed their hand in Charlottesville by coming out so violently. Before that, they really had the positive narrative of like Antifa, being violent. Yeah, they have like it's our free, their argument of free speech was really like winning. Yeah. But then when it was so obvious, they came to Charlottesville to like hurt people and be disgusting. Yeah. And once they killed Heather, it was like gloves are off. You're exposed. People know. And Trump, actually, I think what Trump's comments about good people on both sides saved them. It actually saved them, saved the alt-right. They would have been hurt more if Donald Trump like didn't actually like back them up. So, that's another reason why like it's important to be like opposing Trump and like his policies and like because he's basically giving, cover to like the white nationalists and things like that.
And like, there's a in some ways a statement that like Trump is a fascist. Yeah. And I think, Trump is too dumb in some ways even to be like I think Trump is a proto-fascist, definitely has fascist tendencies. I think that if he were more able and more intelligent and more organized, he might be, a legitimate fascist force. But it seems to me that Donald Trump is like what you said, a cover for rising fascist organizations and organizing. That he kind of let the release valve a bit, and this whole alt-right proto-fascist, like admittedly fascist sort of the whole thing that was kind of tamped down a bit. And, I think rising with Obama, but still tamped down. Oh,
I think it was rising with the wars in Iraq. I really think like the invasion of Iraq and the Middle East and the 2000, we didn't get to talk about this, but those wars, the 2008 recession, the social movements of 2011 and like beyond that. Also, like you have like the Tea Party movement, the reaction to Obama. I think one of the largest rises of like racist organizations came after Obama's election.
Yeah.
That was like, that emboldened them a lot.
Yeah, if you look at the sort of dialectical way that this goes, right, you have movements, you have all of these things that happen and the reactions to it. And one of the reactions to 2008 was Occupy, and the other one was the Tea Party. And I think in one way there was a euphoria about the election of Barack Obama from the left and identity politicians and things like that, who were really focused on like, we got to get, a black president. And then you had at the same time the antithesis of that, which is like, America's gone to hell. Look what we've done, and
Obama's like a Muslim, and he's
born in Kenya.
Yeah, no, where's your birth certificate?
Right, which is of course how Donald Trump got onto the scene.
So racist.
Yeah, and when we see the election of Donald Trump, that is an antithesis kind of moment. That's the dialectic moving in that opposite direction, which gives cover and an openness to these forces to organize. Now, he isn't himself organizing these forces,
no,
which I think is different than an Adolf Hitler or a Benito Mussolini or a Franco character. But it's very American in the sense that it's I'm not doing this, but good people on both sides.
He's setting it up. He's setting up, like, for the next person with a personality that's strong, that is like, is forceful or whatever, is like, Trump has this sort of personality that I think like attracts fascists, and will like, I don't know, is like setting the ground, is like normalizing the type of behavior that like an actual fascist would bring, which that scares me, right? And like the Democrats are letting this happen, basically letting this happen without, in my opinion, without like impeaching him, without like, I don't know, I've been on this, like, this whole impeachment stuff is on my mind right now because the Democrats won't do it, and it's like, why not? Like, even if it doesn't work, at least it's on the books,
right?
That we didn't accept this man, But like, even still,
he was a criminal and corrupt, and also, I mean, he's been impeachable since day fucking one.
Exactly.
And so it's amazing to me that they don't have the political will, because I mean,
let's bash on the Dems for a bit, can't we?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the thing that's frustrating about that though is that if you do look at the kind of politics of it, it's almost as if nothing bad. Like that, everything that seems bad for Trump is a win for whoever's lying in wait. You try to impeach Donald Trump, and it's gonna piss off all of the people who would be with Trump no matter what, and may push them farther into more. It could radicalize people towards a more fascist. Like, oh, what we really need is somebody strong who isn't going to take that kind of shit.
Do you think that's what the Democrats are worried about?
I think that some of them are worried about that.
Like the backlash of like a radical right.
Right.
Like getting mobilized.
I think they are. What I don't understand about the Democrats, honestly, is that although they may have that concern, and if they do have that concern, why you wouldn't be going all in for Bernie? Because Bernie is the antithesis to Trump that would rally a bunch of Trump people that they weren't able to get in 2016 and won't get with Kamala Harris or Joe Biden or Cory fucking Booker. They're not. Those people are going to get captured by Bernie Sanders. He's popular amongst Fox News. He's more popular amongst Fox News viewers than Donald Trump is. That's really an incredible statistic if you think about it. And the fact that the Democrats aren't all that Bernie isn't essentially the anointed character, and they're saying, no, we don't want 20 people in this race. We want.
Well, what is it? That makes me ask the question, what is it about, right? Is it actually about winning, or is it about control? Is it about power?
It's about maintaining their corporate Democratic position that Bill Clinton pushed them into.
But I think it's, yes, I agree with that. But I'm starting to think it's more of like a personal, like, power thing. It's like Pelosi and Schumer just like unwilling to give up what they think is theirs.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
And they don't want, like, and because they think it's theirs, they don't think anyone else should have it. And so they like they're in control of the party, and that's how they want it. And it's like, no one's going to take it from us.
Yeah, I think that's
Bernie, endorsing Bernie would be endorsing Ocasio-Cortez would be endorsing, other
the
other progressives.
anti-establishment Democratic tradition.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think that they see, given the way the Democrats are acting, they see Bernie Sanders as more of a threat than Donald Trump. At the end of the day, Donald Trump is good for Democrats because it pisses people off. And they are I really think that the Democrats are very pessimistic. They're very real politicky. They don't want vision. They don't want these new ideas. They have reluctantly come on to the idea of like Medicare for all and those kinds of things, but very reluctantly. The Democratic Party made a significant switch, just like the Labor Party did in the 90s with Bill Clinton and Tony Blair and those kind of characters, where you really went much more to the center and really to the right. I mean, the Democratic Party is basically the Republican Party of the 50s.
Yeah, sad.
And,
so sad.
And it's amazing. And like, I mean, there's a part of me that hopes that Bernie Sanders gets screwed again and starts a third party. The Social Democratic Party.
He'll be like what, 90?
Well, I mean, it would be helpful to have somebody.
Sorry,
like
I shouldn't bash on his age because everybody.
He seems like he's in good shape.
That's the only thing people have against him. Every time it's like, oh, do you like Bernie? It's like, oh, well, he's old. I'm like, that's the only thing
Joe
you
Biden.
hate.
He's whatever. That's like if you wanted to play those kind of politics, that's very ageist. Older people can be older. I'm amazed that Bernie Sanders is as old as he is with the kind of politics that he is because that's not the common old person that you're gonna you meet an older person on the street. They're usually not talking like Bernie Sanders unless they remember the New Deal. My step grandpa who passed away not that long ago, he was a staunch Democrat. Like, I think that he would have, in most other cases, you would have assumed that he'd been some right-wing Fox News watching Republican, but he remembered the New Deal and he worked on farms. And he was like, the Democrats cared about us.
Yeah.
And, the Republicans never cared about us. They wanted to screw the New Deal.
Yeah.
And, and I think, Bernie Sanders isn't talking anything radical. He's got Eisenhower's politics. It's not really that radical.
Just bringing it back to anti-fascism. I think the role the Democrats play as basically, well, what am I trying to say here? I think, social democracy, I don't think will be able to really stop fascism.
No, it never has.
Yeah. Exactly. It never has. So, but I do think that, we have to discuss what the role of the Democratic Party is in, in helping, Donald Trump and people like Donald Trump come to power, right? So the Obama administration, 8 years, was voted in on this sort of backlash to George Bush,
and hope and change,
right? And Obama, it's safe to say that he did not deliver on the hope and change, which led to, I think, a lot of demoralization. It led to the right wing being able to, swing back into power, and because of capitalism, because of the period that we're in right now, and the sort of crisis, I would say, that the Republican Party is in, Donald Trump was able to actually win the primary, and that's unbelievable. That was unbelievable at the time. I remember I was in Greece in 2015, the summer, right when Donald Trump announced his election, and I was with Greek comrades, and they were like, "Oh, is this for real? Like a billionaire? Donald Trump running for president?" And I was like, "No, it's just a publicity stunt. He has no chance."
Right. That's what I thought.
Yeah.
I mean, misread that situation completely.
Well, that's the thing. We have, as activists, as socialists, we really have to analyze the period that we're in, the forces, I don't think anyone saw the crisis in the Republican Party being as deep as it is, and it's maintained too. It's not. I think there's still a crisis, which Trump is going to take advantage of in 2020.
Right.
And then what do they do when Trump is gone? What is their platform like? That's good. They basically have to hold on to that sort of Trump base.
Yep.
which is like
the idea that the never Trumpers are going to somehow retake control of the Republican Party.
Yeah.
I don't see that happening at all. I think it's a Trump party, and it's going to be a Trump party
and
for a while.
What we've seen too from the far right and the fascists is like they're seeing this as an opening to actually run candidates in the Republican Party in certain areas, like in the Northwest.
Mm-hmm.
They're running like state senators and things like that. They're actually like Joey Gibson, who's founder of Patriot Prayer out in like Oregon. He's Portland, Oregon. He's running ballot initiatives in certain counties that will make their counties sanctuary cities for gun rights.
Wow.
So like the state will implement gun laws, but if you're in a certain county that has a sanctuary, then those gun laws won't be allowed there. So think about that for a second. Who's going to have the guns and who won't?
Yeah, right.
But he's trying to, use ballot initiatives, use like legitimate, forms of, the state to like reach out to people. And these people are like openly racist and xenophobic. And
yeah, I mean, it makes the organizing against that even that much more important. On that too, when we were going to August 12th.
We were talking about
next
August 12th, weren't we? Yeah, we.
I remember in the run up to the anniversary, a lot of good organizing that was done around the A12. And so what happened, the year after Charlottesville in DC?
Yeah, so sorry for the sidetrack.
No, that's an important sidetrack.
That's how I can never pass up a chance to talk about the Dems.
The Democratic Party, yeah.
So, actually, after Charlottesville, I actually had to take a break from politics for a while. I was
understandable,
pretty burnt out from the first year of organizing against Trump and stuff. But once the 1 year anniversary came around, I started to get back involved. Jason Kessler, the initial organizer for Unite the Right in Charlottesville, was organizing an anniversary rally to celebrate Unite the Right with having a white civil rights rally. Basically protesting.
Amazing.
I don't even actually know.
They play identity politics, which is the thing that really amazes me about that, is that it's this the white identity politics. It's a co-opting of what usually is a lefty kind of thing into this. Right. Into this white European American identity politics.
I mean, I think I don't know. I mean, a lot of the danger with fascism is this connection with the left, like this brown-red alliance type situation and like this sort of anti-corporate, anti-capitalist, like these sort of lines start to blur. And I think when that starts to happen, you're like, there's more potential for the far right to gain the kind of numbers that will really make them dangerous.
Yeah.
And so we have to, like, the left has to be really like prepared for that. And I think we need to be prepared by having organizations that can like explain like what's happening in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Anyways, back to A12.
Yeah.
So he was having this rally at the White House. They have the right wing likes to have rallies at the White House because their buddies living there.
Sure.
And they have the police protection. The run up to A12, the anniversary, was much better, I would say, than the original Charlottesville. In DC, there's a vibrant left that was able to organize open organizing coalition meetings to discuss what kind of tactics and strategy that we were going to take to confront the far right when they showed up. And we had all different types of people, from anarchists to socialists to, all BLM to indigenous activists. A lot of different environmentalists were also involved. But we basically decided on having a broad, outward-facing rally where we could have as many people as possible participate. So as a way to both for safety, because we wanted to outnumber. We think that like having outnumbering the fascists when we confront them is one of the safest things we can do to protect ourselves. Also, outnumbering them will provide like ideological sort of support, because it shows that the majority of people are actually against their ideas,
right?
And it throws their ideology into like a tailspin.
Mm-hmm.
So if like even if they have like new recruits that are coming out to a rally, they see that there's like many more people against them, and they realize like, hey, wait a second, maybe this isn't like what the majority of people want or whatever, and it will like, basically like challenge their ideas. So we won that argument to have like a broad rally. It was a really great rally. I've heard people talk about it being like a festival of the oppressed, where everyone was coming together, and we were able to mobilize like regionally from along the East Coast for people to come. We met at Freedom Plaza, which was not too far from the White House, and we then marched over to the White House, where there were already anti-racists rallying. The the right wing came with about 20 people, and we had about 1,000, so we won there. And when we showed up, they had like a 10-minute rally. They couldn't even hear themselves. None of us could hear them for sure. And then they left. Some of the interesting things about that was they had a private escort by MPD.
Wow.
They had a private train that was provided by Metro.
For 20 people.
Yeah, for 20 people. They shut down like a whole train. There was, however, like a pretty good backlash from the mainstream in DC. The mayor came out against the far right having this rally here. Local businesses said they would not be serving like any like white supremacists or participants of the Unite the Right 2 rally. And so there was a sense of like, I don't know, like a more broad sort of sense that we're not accepting this, and not just from the far left, but from like more like mainstream, moderate center people. And it's kind of ironic because literally like a year and a half before, I'm incriminating myself right now, but I was putting up flyers for an anti-fascist rally at the Lincoln Memorial on the Metro, like in the trains or whatever, where you're not supposed to do that.
Yeah.
But like, I'm like, this is important. I'm putting this on a train. And a young woman, as I put it up, she tore it down.
Wow.
And she yelled at me and she said, "You're not supposed to put up flyers on the Metro." And I got so angry. I was like, "Do you know what this is?" I'm like, I'm trying to like organize against Nazis.
Yeah.
And she was telling me, "There are no Nazis. What are you talking about? Nazis don't exist." So, given her statement like a year and a half before, Nazis don't exist, to like the, actions on 8/12 of the anniversary rally where, local news, mass media, like corporate media, CNN covered that.
Yeah.
So it's like, now do you see that there's like Nazis? But just that progression, it's like no one knew about it. Then Charlottesville happened. And then everyone knows about it. It's just like,
yeah. And I think that the A12 rally, as it's called, was a success. I mean, it was just
absolutely
it was an incredible.
I mean, that put
people.
That put us on the same level as when like the response to Charlottesville. Remember the response to the actions in Charlottesville were like 40,000 people protested against a right-wing rally in Boston the week after Charlottesville.
Right.
You had like mass sort of actions of solidarity around the country. And this was like one of the first times we saw that happen again, like a year later, which was was really good for the movement, and especially for DC. A lot of people, activists involved in that action, are now working together in a coalition, DC United Against Hate, to continue this work.
And one of the sort of turning to DC United Against Hate, the organization that you're doing a lot of good work with. I think what's important is you have this sort of dialectical back and forth. You have there are no Nazis, the Charlottesville, the A12.
Yeah.
And the rise of Donald Trump and like we talked about, a kind of proto-fascism kind of thing, giving cover to the rise of this fascist organizing. In the rest of the world, turning internationally for a second, there has been a well-documented and often discussed rise of the far right, and I would say of even more fascist kind of people. And so you have what amounts to, I mean, I think in some ways, the beginning of this starts in 2008, in the reaction to 2008, and the Euro crisis in Europe particularly. I think you mentioned being in Greece. Mm-hmm. And in Greece, there is Golden Dawn, which is an admittedly fascist, neo-Nazi party, and who are using that fascist rhetoric of being against the Troika, but also being against European inclusionism and those kinds of things. Mm-hmm. So you have the Golden Dawn in Greece. You have a rise of a far-right party in Hungary. Mm-hmm. You have you have
Vox in Spain. You have the Northern League in Italy. You have UKIP in the fucking UK.
Yeah, you have who's the group in Germany?
Alternative for Germany. Alternative for Germany. AFD.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. So you have and in Italy, same thing.
Yeah, MSI, are they still around? I don't know.
I think so. But this is not, and it's not even in Europe. You have in the Philippines, Duterte. Mm-hmm. In Brazil, you have Bolsonaro. So this is, to be appropriately alarmist, I would say, a rising trend. What is your way, like the way to understand this whole thing? Because, there's some places where a lot of these times you're looking at, in some ways, failures of left-wing movements. The rise of Donald Trump is a failure of the Democratic Party. The rise of Golden Dawn is, in some ways, a failure of the former Socialist, and then even the failure of Syriza.
I would go so far as to say it's a failure of democracy, of neoliberal democracy. I think the rise of, Donald Trump's victory came out of the crisis of the Republican Party. That crisis comes out of their positions as being like pro-austerity, pro-globalization, companies can go do whatever they want, right? And so they've created this situation where we have basically undemocratic institutions that don't really represent anyone except for the rich.
Yeah.
In Brazil, we have something similar. You have a breakdown of democratic institutions and a breakdown of trust with the main parties because of their implementation of policies that have been hurting people for 20, 30, 40 years. And so, specifically in Brazil, you have these sort of coup attempts through a legal framework to oust the leaders because they broke a law or something. But then you also have the fact that Bolsonaro, who's a proto-fascist, actually won the election because the two other parties are completely in crisis and destroyed, and no one trusts them. So you have this ability of far right figures to sort of take the stage and win that way. We saw that with Trump and Bolsonaro, and I think one of the things I'm working with the International Anti-Fascist Coalition, actually, that we got together for March 16th, which was last March 16th, which is the International UN Day of Anti-Racism. So there was marches around around Europe, and there was a march in New York City. But this coalition, which was started by members of Stand Up to Racism in the UK, have sort of coalesced a bunch of organizers from different European countries mostly, and a few cities in the United States to coordinate our efforts more. And I think like building the anti-fascist movement on an international scale and having these connections is going to be really important to countering the far right, because yes, they have leaders in power, but that's different than like a active fascist movement that's like from below, that's organized like in the streets. And I think right now we still have the power to outnumber them, and we have to do that while we still can, before they like get any more power, which was in some ways the mistake of the 30s. Exactly. And I think you mentioned it too, and I think when you look at where these are rising, it is not in places like Vietnam, Cuba, China, and other places that have nominally socialist or governments, the problems of those notwithstanding. But in many ways, these are the failures of particularly social democracies. So I've had discussions on this podcast, the socialism versus social democracy, the Bernie Sanders democratic socialism in quotes, as compared to actual socialism. And there is this whole idea that, look, we have to make capitalism work for people and be a bit better of be a bit better and give us Medicare for all and doing these kinds of things. And I'm not against those things, because I think those are important things for working people to be able to have. But they've shown themselves not to be enough to prevent the crises that happen, to be able to, inculcate against the rise of fascism. And if you look, I think to me, I would describe the situation in Venezuela not as a failure of socialism, but actually as a failure of social democracy. And I would say a product of capitalism. Right. That social democracy doesn't deal with the big question of capitalism. And the big problems. Nail on the head right there. Just got it. And so the thing that I guess, that I would sort of, my position on that would be, is that if you really want to inculcate, I've seen, there was an old, I think it was a Soviet propaganda poster or something, but it was basically a barrel that was international capitalism with like the US and the UK and Germany and all those, and the barrel was kind of coming apart. And fascism is the sort of bond that keeps all of them together. That when the system breaks apart and isn't working, and capitalism goes into crisis and isn't able to really fix itself, the one thing that can keep capitalism going is fascism. And we're experiencing, we're now in the 11th year of a recession that hasn't ended, and as much as anyone wants to say the stock market's up and everything's great, but we're still in this, and we're staring down the barrel of another crisis. Like even professional economics people are saying, 2021. After Trump's tax cuts run out, like there's going to be no more stock buybacks, and the stock market will tank. The market will tank. Right. And so unless I think whatever, I kind of follow the stock market a bit, and like there's like this whole dynamic with Trump and China and the tariffs, and like this balancing act with like the Federal Reserve, where it's like the Federal Reserve hasn't cut any rates for a while because the market is like on the up and up, but like they have that in their back pocket. So like in the sense when the Fed cuts rates, it's supposed to like normalize the market. So technically we have a backstop, but like not really. But that is not going to prevent against an international financial collapse if that were to happen. But this is why I'm actually so active in the anti-fascist movement, because I do see this like very easily connected link to anti-capitalism through the anti-fascist movement. Because when we talk about like opposing fascism, where does fascism come from? Like, how do we oppose it? Where does it come from? I think it leads you to making the argument that like we need to actually attack capitalism if we want to make sure that fascism will never come to power.
Right, because even if they're attacking capitalism, they're attacking it from a fascist perspective.
Yeah.
And so
whatever a fascist tells you is fucking bullshit. Like, honestly, like
it's a means to get power.
It's a means to get, exactly. It's a means. If you read anything about like Hitler's rise to power, it's like he tells anybody what they want to hear.
Yeah, it was Hitler that said if you tell a lie long enough and hard enough, people eventually think it's the truth. Something that
I don't know
Donald
many
Trump.
Really?
Many
I don't know.
quotes, yeah, fair enough. But that's definitely something that Donald Trump has understood completely.
Absolutely.
And destroyed the whole notion of truth. But
yeah, I mean, that's kind of how Donald Trump, and this is partly what I was talking about before. He's like setting the ground.
Yeah.
He's like fires whoever he wants. Whatever that Scaramucci guy worked for like 11 days and then he fired him. It's like, it's an authoritarian setup where he's just like can just quickly fire whoever doesn't like toe the line or do exactly what he says or gets what he wants, and he'll basically they just lie to people until they get to power, and then they'll kill you if you don't go along, or even if you do go along, they might just kill you anyways because they don't want to take the risk of losing power.
And I think what people don't remember, if you look at the Donald Trump might not be Hitler, but he might be Hindenburg, the person who, the person who paves the way and who allows the kind of, who like you said, lays the groundwork, lays out the red carpet for that person to say, now is my time,
I think also like, connecting Trump to what's going on internationally, Trump being the president of one of the most powerful countries in the world is giving tons of legitimacy to far right, authoritarians around the world. He's legitimizing Bolsonaro, the coup attempt, the coup for the rich attempt in Venezuela would not be possible without like Donald Trump's support,
right?
And with the opposition there, and so it's like, it's having a real effect on what's going on internationally. Our comrades we work with in the coalition, they're very, very interested in what's going on here, like against Donald Trump and against the far right, because they see what's happening in the United States as directly affecting what's going on in their countries.
Sure.
And they're very worried.
Yeah.
And honestly, the United States, we're behind the game as far as like an anti-fascist organized movement compared to Europe. We have a lot of work to do.
What I want you to talk a little bit about DC United Against Hate. You've kind of explained a bit about how it started. It started in some ways in reaction to these kinds of things, but you did say you wanted to more focus on doing more proactive things. So what is DC United Against Hate doing? Yeah, so one of the things that initially got this group together was the fact that the president of the president of Brazil, Bolsonaro, was coming to the United States to have a visit with Trump, a meeting with Trump. And so we got connected to some Brazilian activists that were here in the United States and organized a public panel discussion, which had about 70 people at it at a local library in DC. And then we had a rally against, Bolsonaro's visit when he arrived. And that was really great. We got some, publicity in Brazil, and from what we heard from our Brazilian comrades was that it made an impact a lot for Brazilians seeing Americans protesting against Bolsonaro. Yeah. And so one of the things that DC United Against Hate is focusing on is doing a lot of international solidarity with people who are opposing far-right governments around the world. And the next event we're going to be having is on Turkey and the rise of like authoritarianism and the AKP's like position and Erdogan's like, basically rightward shift. Yeah. There's a party, a right-wing party there, far-right party that has allied themselves with Erdogan and the AKP, and it's really bad. Mm-hmm.
And so we're going to have a panel discussion on June 3rd to talk more about that, learn more about that. And we have some really great speakers from Kurdistan, from Kurdish activists to like Turkish academics. So it should be really great. Other things that we're doing, I think one of our goals is to make A12 a national day of anti-fascism.
Perfect.
Yeah. So we want to basically take the day that the fascists like chose, and we want to make it a day of anti-fascism that remembers the victims of fascism. You know, remember Heather Heyer, remember Richard Collins, and also, you know, I would really like it to be something that is like, you know, targeting Trump as well. Basically using this day as a way for people around the country to form coalitions and organize themselves locally and build, you know, from the ground up. So we want to, you know, one of the goals in my anti-fascist organizing is to try and build like a national network of coalitions that are focused on anti-fascist work. And this, I want to do this for a couple reasons. One reason is to unite the left in a way that can strengthen our numbers and, you know, give us a bigger platform to work from. Another reason is to build the capacity of the movement. A lot of my experience has been like organizing against, you know, the far right. It's very tense, right? These confrontations can be dangerous. It's very stressful, and really we don't have a lot of capacity. So if we can have a national network that's connected, we can actually help local organizers when they want to do protest, you know, by having other people in different cities like contribute to the organizing. Basically I want to, as one of my goals as a socialist also is to build like organizations from the ground up, like building organizations that are built on like the self-activity of the working class and like are democratic and are like making people feel like they have power. So we don't have enough of those in society. And so like definitely like when we're building organizations, we need them to be democratic. We need them to be, you know, committed to anti-oppression. We need them to be, you know, organized like by normal people, and not, you know, by like paid, not always by paid staff, although it would be nice. It would be nice.
Right. Well, that's cool, man. We're, you know, approaching the 1.5 hour mark at this point. So, it's a good conversation, but is there anything else that you wanted to mention that we didn't get to? You got a page full of notes, so I want to like make sure that we touch on what you want to make sure we touch on.
Yeah, you did a great job. We touched on pretty much everything we wanted to. Only other thing I want to mention is what's going on at the Venezuelan embassy. Yeah. Because I think that's going to be something that DC United Against Hate is going to be doing some organizing around. There is an occupation going on at the Venezuelan embassy by anti-US coup activists who are there to protect the embassy from pro-opposition forces taking it over. The idea is that the right-wing opposition in Venezuela will use the embassy to set up a sort of shadow government that's in exile, and use that space to undermine the government of Venezuela. And so and basically like help perpetuate US imperialism in South America ultimately.
Yeah.
And so these activists are, I don't even know, like they've been in there for like 2 weeks.
Yeah.
The US Secret Service cut power a couple days ago, so they have no power.
Yeah, they're preventing food and water from being delivered.
Exactly. They're preventing, like you said, preventing food and water. And I've been there twice, down there twice, and both times, like the rhetoric from the right wing it's completely vile. I'm like, it's really radicalized me even more to see like how sort of disgusting and racist the fascist actually. Yeah, you're right. I've been trying to figure out like how to think of these people because I don't know, it's been hard, but being down there and like seeing their behavior, I mean, they're definitely like red baiting. They're like, you know, they're anti-communist, like
they are fascist-y thugs.
Yeah, and a lot of people don't realize that like Guaido, who's the opposition leader, his party is like far right wing. He's not like a moderate or whatever.
Yeah.
But the goal is to maintain that occupation, provide support from the outside, give solidarity, try and like deliver supplies, whatever we can. A couple of people have been arrested for like, the charge was like throwing missiles, which one person was like throwing a loaf of bread like into the window. And so, but yeah, they're trying to keep people out. And I think it's really important that we keep this embassy for the people of Venezuela. And not just any people of Venezuela, but for the working class and the poor and the like, you know, indigenous of Venezuela. Like that's something that it's made clear to me why this fight is important in Venezuela for the left wing, because if the left wing doesn't, you know, if the right wing succeeds, then that's going to be terrible. It's going to be like atrocities will happen.
Right.
And we can't let that happen. That's not to mention like, you know, the problems with the Maduro government and how that actually is, it's not really helping anything. But at the same time, neither will like a far right-wing government.
Yeah.
So it's a difficult situation. I, urge everyone on, the DC left to come out to the protests and they're in Georgetown. A lot of the right-wing Venezuelans live in Georgetown. So it's very easy for them to come and protest every night. Mm-hmm. And we really need more people to show up. I'm going to be helping organize another panel to try and counter some of the U.S. media narrative behind Venezuela, because I think that's really keeping us from mobilizing. A lot of people, like the liberals and things like that, are afraid to protest because they're like, oh, but Maduro's bad.
Yeah.
And it's like, yes, but the right wing is worse.
Right. Yeah, exactly. The only thing worse than Maduro is a right wing government in Venezuela.
Yeah. And it doesn't help that there's right wing governments in Colombia and Brazil right now.
Yeah.
So
who are the big voices of support for Guaido and stuff like that.
Yeah. But I've heard some good news. I think there's some good news coming, but anyways, yeah.
The fight continues.
Yeah, always.
So if people want to find out about DC United Against Hate or get plugged into the more broad coalition that you're trying to build, how do they get more info?
It's very easy. You can email DC United Against Hate at gmail.com. Just email me. Let us know that you are interested, and we'll get you connected to the Slack and the Google group. And if you have Facebook, we have a Facebook page, DC United Against Hate. Again, it's very easy.
Yeah, it's a catchy enough title. It's good.
Yeah, it kind of stuck with us there's been like a couple iterations of this group. And I'm happy that this one is sticking around. Yeah,
so that's good. All right. Well, thanks a lot for coming on the podcast. I think this is an important topic and will only be one that continues to be more important. So if you're interested, check out DC United Against Hate. Give the support to the Venezuelan embassy thing that you can. And just reach out and do what you can. The fascists are organizing, so we need to as well.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, man. Thanks.
All right.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Cool.
In those days of my